Inflation is a phenomenon that affects the economy of a country in many ways. It occurs when the general price level of goods and services increases over time. When inflation occurs, it affects the purchasing power of people, which means that they can buy fewer goods and services with the same amount of money. While inflation affects everyone in society, it is often the poor who are hit hardest. The first way in which inflation affects the poor is by reducing their purchasing power. When the cost of goods and services increases, the poor, who are often already struggling to make ends meet, are hit hardest. For example, if the cost of food, clothing, and other basic necessities increases, it becomes harder for the poor to afford these things. On the other hand, the rich, who have more disposable income, can absorb the price increases more easily. In addition to reducing the purchasing power of the poor, inflation also increases the cost of borrowing money. This is because lenders will demand a higher interest rate to compensate for the loss of purchasing power caused by inflation. As a result, the poor, who are more likely to rely on borrowing money, end up paying higher interest rates. This means that they have less money to spend on other things, while the rich, who are less likely to rely on borrowing, are not as affected by the higher interest rates. Another way in which inflation affects the poor is through wages. Inflation reduces the value of wages, which means that people earn less in real terms. This is because the increase in the cost of goods and services means that people need more money to maintain the same standard of living. As a result, the poor end up working harder for less money. In contrast, the rich, who often earn money through investments and other forms of passive income, are less affected by the reduction in the value of wages. When inflation occurs, it reduces the value of wages. This means that people have to work harder to maintain the same standard of living, even though they are earning the same nominal amount of money. For the poor, this can be a significant burden, as they often have limited employment opportunities and little bargaining power. They may be forced to work longer hours or take on additional jobs simply to keep up with the rising cost of living. In contrast, the rich often have more flexibility in terms of their employment situation. They may be able to negotiate higher salaries or better working conditions, or they may have passive income streams that are less affected by inflation. For example, a wealthy person who earns income from rental properties or investments may not be as concerned about inflation, as they can adjust their prices to compensate for the rise in the cost of living. This disparity between the rich and the poor can lead to a situation where the rich benefit from the hard work of the poor, while the poor themselves see little benefit. The rich can continue to profit from their investments and other income streams, while the poor are left struggling to make ends meet. This can create resentment and frustration among the poor, who may feel like they are working hard for very little reward. Furthermore, this situation can perpetuate a cycle of poverty, where the poor are unable to save money or invest in their own futures. As a result, they remain trapped in low-paying jobs and are unable to build wealth over time. Meanwhile, the rich continue to accumulate more and more wealth, using the hard work of the poor to generate their income. Inflation also affects the poor by increasing the cost of living. When inflation occurs, the cost of housing, transportation, and other basic necessities increase, which means that the poor have to spend more money on these things. This means that they have less money to spend on other things, such as education, health care, and leisure activities. In contrast, the rich, who often have more money to spare, can continue to enjoy their standard of living, despite the increase in the cost of living. Moreover, inflation also affects the poor by reducing their ability to save money. When the cost of living increases, people have less money to put aside for savings. This means that the poor, who are more likely to have low levels of savings, are unable to build a financial cushion to help them in times of need. In contrast, the rich, who often have more money to spare, can continue to save and invest their money, which allows them to build wealth over time. Finally, inflation affects the poor by reducing their access to credit. When inflation occurs, lenders become more risk-averse, which means that they are less likely to lend money to people who are already struggling to make ends meet. This means that the poor, who are more likely to have a low credit score and a history of financial difficulties, are unable to access the credit they need to improve their financial situation. In contrast, the rich, who often have high credit scores and significant assets, can continue to access credit, even during times of inflation. When inflation causes the value of wages to decrease, it can exacerbate existing wealth disparities. This means that the rich, who are often already in a privileged position, can continue to accumulate more wealth at the expense of the poor. As a result, a cycle of poverty and inequality can emerge, where the poor struggle to make ends meet, while the rich continue to prosper. Moreover, the government can also benefit from inflation, as it can help them to continue to expense more than the country earns. This is because inflation can increase the amount of money that the government has to spend, without necessarily increasing the value of that money. In other words, the government can continue to spend more money than it earns, while inflation reduces the real value of that spending. This can be a powerful tool for governments that are looking to fund social programs or infrastructure projects, as they can do so without necessarily raising taxes or cutting spending in other areas. However, this approach to government spending can also have negative consequences. When governments spend more money than they earn, they can create long-term economic problems, such as high levels of debt and inflation. This can be especially damaging for poor and middle-class citizens, who may struggle to keep up with the rising cost of living. Furthermore, this approach to government spending can create an environment of economic instability, which can make it harder for businesses to grow and for citizens to plan for their futures. Inflation is a transfer of money from poor people to rich people, and the government benefit from inflation. Money printing is here to stay. The poor are hit hardest by inflation, as it reduces their purchasing power, increases the cost of borrowing, reduces the value of wages, increases the cost of living, reduces their ability to save money, and reduces their access to credit. Ultimately, this can perpetuate a cycle of poverty and inequality, as the rich continue to accumulate more and more wealth, while the poor struggle to make ends meet. Inflation can have a profound impact on the distribution of wealth and the well-being of citizens. When the cost of living rises, it can be harder for the poor to accumulate wealth and build a secure future for themselves and their families. At the same time, the government can benefit from inflation by continuing to spend more money than it earns. While this approach can help fund social programs and infrastructure projects, it can also create long-term economic problems and perpetuate cycles of poverty and inequality. As such, it is important for citizens alike to carefully consider the impact of inflation on the economy and on their own financial well-being. This is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as financial advice. Please consult a financial professional before making any financial decisions. Please, comment, like and subscribe.